Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. The small town of Ravenswood was tucked away in a secluded valley, surrounded by dense forests and towering mountains. With its cobblestone streets, charming wooden houses, and close-knit community, it seemed like the perfect postcard town. But beneath its picturesque surface lay a dark secret, one that kept the townsfolk indoors after sunset. By day, Ravenswood was alive with the chatter of neighbors, the laughter of children playing in the park, and the hum of life. But as the sun began to set, an unspoken fear gripped the town. The streets would empty, shops would close early, and windows would be shuttered. For as long as anyone could remember, Ravenswood had been haunted by shadow creatures, amorphous, shifting forms that emerged as soon as night fell. They slithered through the streets, melted into the walls, and seeped into every corner of darkness. They never ventured into the light, but those who encountered them in the shadows often disappeared, never to be seen again. Amelia Hayes had only lived in Ravenswood for 6 months. A journalist by trade, she had come to the town to escape the chaos of city life after a particularly devastating breakup. At first, she found Ravenswood charming, even idyllic, but it wasn't long before she noticed the town's peculiarities. The warnings had started almost immediately. Her neighbor, an elderly woman named Edith, had knocked on her door one evening just as the sky was turning orange. "You must stay inside after dark," Edith said, her voice trembling. "And keep the lights on. All of them." Amelia had laughed it off. "I think I'll be fine. I'm not afraid of the dark." Edith's face darkened. "It's not the dark you should fear, my dear. It's what lives in it." Curiosity got the better of Amelia one night. With her lights turned off and her curtains slightly parted, she watched the empty streets from her second-floor window. At first, there was nothing but the stillness of the night, but then she saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of the street lamp's glow. A shadow darted across the pavement, moving unnaturally, as though it were being carried by the wind. It stopped at the base of a tree, pooling there like ink spilling from an unseen bottle. Then it began to rise, forming a vaguely humanoid shape with elongated limbs and a featureless face. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She scrambled to turn on her lamp, the warm glow banishing the darkness in her room. The creature below seemed to recoil, collapsing into itself and slithering back into the shadows. The next day, Amelia couldn't shake what she had seen. She visited the local diner, hoping to glean some information from the townsfolk. At first, they were reluctant to talk, but after some persistence and a promise not to publish anything, they began to share their stories. "They've always been here," said Mr. Grayson, the town's librarian. "No one knows where they came from, but the earliest records of Ravenswood mention shadow apparitions. Some say they're the spirits of an ancient people who were wronged. Others believe they're something far older, far darker. People used to fight back," added Clara, the waitress. "Back when my grandfather was young, they'd light bonfires and carry torches. But it didn't matter. The shadows always came back." "What happens if you're caught in the dark with them?" Amelia asked. The table went silent. Finally, Edith spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't come back, and if you do, you're not the same." 2 nights later, the peace of Ravenswood was shattered by a blood-curdling scream. Amelia, watching from her window, saw a young boy running through the street, a shadow creature close behind. He tripped and fell just outside the circle of light cast by a street lamp. Before anyone could react, the shadow enveloped him. Amelia could hear his cries for help, muffled and fading, until there was silence. When the creature slithered away, the boy was gone. The next morning, the townsfolk gathered to mourn. His name was Ethan, and he had been only 10 years old. His mother, inconsolable, begged for someone to do something. "We can't keep living like this," she sobbed. "There has to be a way to stop them." Amelia, shaken by Ethan's death, resolved to take action. She couldn't sit idly by while the town lived in fear. She spent days researching the shadow creatures, scouring the library for old journals, newspapers, and folklore. She discovered references to an ancient artifact, a lantern said to have been created by the town's founders. It was called the Eternal Flame, and according to legend, its light could banish the shadows permanently. But the lantern had been lost decades ago, buried somewhere in the woods surrounding Ravenswood. Despite the warnings of the townsfolk, Amelia ventured into the forest with a group of volunteers. Among them were Edith, Mr. Grayson, and Clara, each armed with flashlights and lanterns. The forest was dense and unnervingly quiet. The deeper they went, the darker it became, as though the trees were absorbing the sunlight. After hours of searching, they found it, a small stone altar overgrown with moss. At its center was the Eternal Flame, a lantern made of silver and etched with strange runes. Its light was faint but steady, as though it had been waiting for someone to find it. That night, the townsfolk gathered in the town square. The Eternal Flame was placed at the center, its light growing brighter as the sun set. Amelia and the others carried torches, creating a perimeter of light. As the clock struck midnight, the shadows came. They poured into the square like a tide, hissing and writhing as they encountered the light. The Eternal Flame flared, its glow expanding outward. The shadow creatures screamed, a terrible, high-pitched wail that made Amelia's ears ring. One by one, they dissolved into nothingness, unable to withstand the light. By dawn, the town was silent. The shadows were gone. Ravenswood began to heal. The streets were no longer deserted at night, and the townsfolk no longer lived in fear. The Eternal Flame was placed in the town hall, a reminder of their triumph over the darkness. Amelia stayed in Ravenswood, documenting the town's history and ensuring its story would never be forgotten. She had come seeking inspiration, but found something far greater, a purpose. And though the shadows were gone, she never forgot the lesson they had taught her, that even in the darkest of times, light would always prevail. The phenomenon began quietly, whispered about in coffee shops and passed along as rumors in online forums. People across the world were experiencing the same unsettling dream, a humanoid figure with no face. The details varied from person to person, but certain elements remained constant. The figure was tall, unnervingly still, and radiated a sense of cold dread. At first, it was dismissed as a strange coincidence, the product of overactive imaginations. But as more stories surfaced, a chilling pattern emerged. The dreams weren't just dreams, they were warnings. Celia Martin was the first person to speak publicly about the Faceless One. A 32-year-old teacher from Chicago, she appeared on a podcast to recount her experience. "I was in a meadow," she explained, her voice trembling. "Everything felt off. The sky was too bright and the air was too still. Then I saw it, this tall, faceless figure standing at the edge of the field. It didn't move. It didn't speak, but I knew it was looking at me. I couldn't wake up. I couldn't even scream." Others listening to the podcast were stunned. They had seen the same figure in their own dreams. Within days, social media exploded with stories and sketches of the Faceless One, each eerily similar despite being shared by strangers from different parts of the world. As weeks turned into months, the dreams grew more frequent and more vivid. Some dreamers found themselves in desolate forests, others in endless corridors. But the Faceless One was always there, silent, watching. For most, the dreams were terrifying but harmless. However, a small number of dreamers began to report physical symptoms: exhaustion, migraines, and a chilling sensation that lingered long after waking. Marcus Lee, a software engineer from Seoul, described his experience in a viral blog post. "It's not just a dream anymore. I wake up with scratches on my arms, cold to the touch. My room feels like a freezer, even with the heater on full blast. And every night, the figure gets closer." Marcus's story sent shockwaves through the online community. What had once been dismissed as a shared nightmare was now something far more sinister. Scientists, psychologists, and paranormal investigators all weighed in, each with their own theories about the Faceless One. 1. Mass psychogenic illness. Psychologists suggested the phenomenon was a form of mass hysteria. The spread of the stories through social media and news outlets had created a shared cultural experience that manifested in dreams. 2. Collective subconscious. Others believed the Faceless One was an archetype from the collective unconscious, a concept popularized by Carl Jung. According to this theory, the figure represented humanity's universal fears of the unknown, of losing identity, of being watched. Third, paranormal entity. Paranormal enthusiasts had a different explanation. They argued the faceless one was a malevolent being capable of invading dreams and feeding off fear. Some even claimed it had existed for centuries, citing ancient texts and folklore that described similar faceless figures. The true horror began when the faceless one crossed the boundary between dreams and reality. Maria Lopez, a nurse from Mexico City, was the first to report seeing the figure while awake. She had been driving home late at night when she spotted it standing under a flickering street lamp. "It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me," she told reporters. "When I blinked, it was gone." Her story was quickly followed by others. The faceless one began appearing in mirrors, lurking at the edges of photographs and manifesting in darkened corners. For those who had seen it in their dreams, these encounters felt like an escalation. It was as if the figure was growing stronger, finding new ways to invade their lives. Desperate for answers, a group of dreamers formed an online collective called the Watchers. They pooled their experiences, analyzed patterns, and even experimented with lucid dreaming to confront the faceless one. One of their members, a lucid dreamer named Daniel Carter, claimed to have spoken to the figure. In a video posted to the group's forum, he described the encounter. "I was in a dark room, completely empty except for the faceless one. I forced myself to stay calm and asked it what it wanted. It tilted its head like it was trying to understand me. Then it reached out and I heard a voice, not with my ears but in my mind. It said, 'You called me.'" The Watchers pieced together a terrifying theory. The faceless one wasn't just a passive observer. It was a reflection of humanity's collective fear and despair. The more people thought about it, talked about it, and feared it, the stronger it became. By sharing their stories, the dreamers had unwittingly summoned the entity into existence, giving it a foothold in their world. Realizing they had to act, the Watchers devised a plan to weaken the faceless one. They believed it thrived on fear and attention, so their goal was to starve it by breaking the cycle of obsession. They launched a global campaign called Forget the Faceless, urging people to stop sharing stories, stop drawing sketches, and stop fearing the figure. They encouraged dreamers to confront their fears in their dreams, to stand tall and refuse to let the figure intimidate them. At first, progress was slow, but as weeks turned into months, the sightings diminished. The dreams became less frequent, and the faceless one's presence began to fade. Years later, the phenomenon was mostly forgotten, reduced to an urban legend. But for those who had encountered the faceless one, the memories remained vivid. Amelia, now a writer, reflected on her experience in a memoir. "It's easy to dismiss fear as irrational, but fear has power. The faceless one taught us that power can be given or taken away. We created it and we defeated it." Still, on rare occasions, someone would report a dream, a dark room, a tall figure, and an overwhelming sense of dread. And somewhere in the deep recesses of the human mind, the faceless one waited, patient and silent, for the day it might be remembered again. For as long as Elias Gray could remember, the moon had been both his solace and his torment. Born under a blood moon in a remote village nestled in the shadow of a dense forest, Elias was marked by a curse passed down through generations. But unlike the legends told in hushed tones by fireside, stories of men who became wolves beneath the full moon, Elias's curse was cruelly incomplete. He never transformed. Instead, he endured the agony of transformation without the release. Bones stretched and twisted, but never broke. His skin burned as though it were tearing apart, though it remained whole. His senses sharpened to the brink of madness, yet his body remained frustratingly, painfully human. The elders of the village called it the empty curse, a punishment so cruel it seemed to mock the very nature of lycanthropy. The curse had been placed on Elias's bloodline centuries ago. According to legend, an ancestor named Luther Gray had betrayed a pack of werewolves he had sworn to protect. In retribution, the pack's alpha, a monstrous beast named Barak, cursed Luthor's lineage to forever feel the torment of the wolf without the freedom it brought. Elias had grown up with the weight of this legacy. His father Henry had been afflicted by the same curse, And Elias had spent his childhood watching the man writhe and scream on moonlit nights. Henry had died young, his body unable to endure the repeated strain. By the time Elias turned 21 and experienced his first transformation, he was already terrified of what his life would become. The pain began slowly, a dull ache in his joints as the moon rose, its silver light seeping into his very bones. Then came the searing heat, as though fire coursed through his veins, and the crushing pressure in his chest. Elias would collapse to the floor, clutching at his ribs as his body convulsed. His hands would claw at his skin, seeking release from a transformation that never came. His screams echoed through the small cottage he had inherited from his father, carrying out into the empty woods. When the moon finally set, Elias would be left shattered and broken, drenched in sweat and blood from where his fingernails had raked his own flesh. But his body remained the same, a man trapped in a cage of agony. The villagers feared Elias, though he had never harmed them. To them, he was a reminder of the curse's existence, a living embodiment of their shared unease. Whispers followed him wherever he went. Poor boy, never asked for it. He's dangerous, even if he doesn't change. He'll snap one day, mark my words. Eventually, Elias stopped going into the village. He lived off the land, hunting and farming what he could. The solitude was both a blessing and a curse. He didn't have to endure the villagers' judgment, but he was left alone with his torment. One autumn evening, as Elias prepared for another night of agony, he heard a knock at his door. He opened it to find a woman cloaked in black, her piercing green eyes shimmering in the fading light. "My name is Lyra," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I've been looking for you, Elias Gray." Elias frowned. "Who are you? What do you want?" Lyra placed a small leather satchel on the table and began unpacking vials of strange liquids and herbs. "I know about your curse. I've studied curses like yours for years. I think I can help." Elias was skeptical. "Help? No one can help. This curse killed my father. It will kill me too." Lyra's gaze softened. "Perhaps, but what if I told you there's a way to end it?" Over the next few days, Lyra explained her plan. According to her research, the curse could be undone by invoking the spirit of the wolf that had cursed Elias's ancestor. But the ritual was dangerous. It required Elias to confront Varroc's spirit in the Shadow Realm, a place where time and reality twisted, and where the pain he endured would be magnified tenfold. Elias hesitated. The thought of enduring more pain was unbearable, but the idea of freedom, of finally being free from the torment, was too tempting to ignore. "I'll do it," he said. On the night of the full moon, Lyra prepared the ritual. A circle of runes was etched into the dirt around Elias's cottage, and a fire burned brightly at its center. Lyra chanted in an ancient language, her voice rising and falling like the howling wind. Elias stepped into the circle, clutching a silver dagger Lyra had given him. "You'll need this," she had said. "The wolf's heart must be pierced to break the curse." As the moon reached its zenith, the world around Elias shifted. The forest melted away, replaced by a desolate landscape of ash and shadows. The air was thick with the stench of blood and decay, and then he saw it. The wolf spirit towered over him, its eyes glowing like molten gold. Its body was made of shadow, its form constantly shifting and reforming. "So, you've come to end your suffering," Varroc growled, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to shake the ground. "Do you think you are worthy of freedom?" Varroc lunged, his claws slashing through the air. Elias barely dodged, the dagger trembling in his hand. The spirit wolf was faster and stronger than anything he had ever faced. The fight was brutal. Each time Varroc struck, Elias felt the pain of his curse amplified, his bones snapping, his skin burning. But each time he forced himself to rise, to fight back. "You will never be free," Varroc roared, lunging again. Elias saw his chance. As Varroc leapt, Elias drove the dagger into the wolf's chest. The spirit howled, its form exploding into shards of light and shadow. Elias woke to find himself lying on the forest floor, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees. The pain was gone. For the first time in years, he felt whole. Lyra stood over him, a faint smile on her lips. "You did it," she said. Elias returned to the village, his curse lifted. The villagers, once fearful, welcomed him back with cautious curiosity. Over time, they came to see him as a symbol of resilience and hope, a man who had faced unimaginable torment and emerged victorious. Though the scars of his ordeal remained, Elias found peace. He had been freed not just from his curse, but from the isolation and fear that had defined his life. And on nights when the moon was full, he would sit beneath its light, unburdened, finally at peace with the wolf within. In the remote village of Arendor, nestled at the base of a jagged mountain range, the air carried an unspoken warning. No one ventured out after sunset, and every door was reinforced with iron charms and thick bolts. For generations, the village had been haunted by a banshee whose scream could kill instantly. Her presence was both a curse and a legend, whispered about in hushed tones but never spoken aloud in fear of summoning her wrath. The banshee's name was forgotten to time, but her haunting wail was etched into the collective memory of the villagers. They claimed her cry could freeze the blood in your veins and silence the heartbeat in your chest. The mere thought of it was enough to keep children in line and adults vigilant. Long ago, Arendor had been a prosperous place, known for its vibrant markets and lush farmland, but its prosperity came at a cost. The legend said that centuries ago, a woman named Fiad had lived in the village, a healer who helped the sick and injured. Her beauty was matched only by her kindness, and her skill with herbs and remedies was unparalleled. But jealousy is a cruel master. Fiad's talents earned the envy of a powerful nobleman who demanded her hand in marriage. When she refused, he accused her of witchcraft. The villagers, afraid of the nobleman's wrath, turned on her. One cold winter's night, Fiad was dragged from her home and executed on the edge of the forest. Her screams of agony and betrayal echoed through the night, her dying breath laced with a curse. "You will know no peace. My voice will haunt your bloodlines until the end of time." The next morning, the nobleman and every villager who had laid hands on her were found dead, their faces frozen in terror. The curse had begun. For centuries, the banshee's scream haunted Arendor. It was said she appeared as a pale, translucent figure with wild silver hair and empty, hollow eyes. She wore the tattered remnants of a healer's dress, stained with the blood of her betrayal. The banshee never attacked without cause, but her scream would come as punishment for those who dared disturb the fragile peace she allowed. Those who heard her wail didn't have time to react. Death was instant and absolute. The villagers developed rituals to appease her. Offerings of herbs, flowers, and hand-carved charms were left at the edge of the forest where she had died. It wasn't enough to stop her entirely, but it lessened her appearances. One autumn evening, a traveler arrived in Arendor. His name was Kieran, a scholar from a distant kingdom. He was tall and wiry with piercing green eyes that missed nothing. He had heard of the Banshee of Arendor and had come to study her legend. The villagers were horrified. They begged him to leave, warning that curiosity would only bring death. But Kieran was undeterred. "I don't fear ghosts," he said with a small smile. "And if her scream is truly fatal, then perhaps I can find a way to stop it." Despite their protests, Kieran rented a small room in the village and began his research. He interviewed the elders, pored over ancient texts, and spent hours sketching the iron charms that adorned every home. One night, as Kieran sat in the village tavern, the banshee's wail tore through the air. It was a sound like no other, a high-pitched, bone-chilling scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The villagers froze, their faces pale with terror. Kieran stood, his resolve unshaken. "Where is she?" he asked. "No!" the tavern keeper hissed, grabbing his arm. "Stay here. She's claimed another, and she'll leave if we don't interfere." But Kieran refused to cower. Armed with nothing but his wits and a satchel of herbs, he stepped into the night. The village was eerily silent, save for the faint echo of the banshee's cry. At the edge of the forest, he saw her. She hovered above the ground, her ghostly form illuminated by the pale moonlight. Her empty eyes turned toward him, and for a moment, the air seemed to freeze. "I mean you no harm," Kieran said, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped him. "I want to understand your pain." The banshee tilted her head, her hair swirling around her like a storm. For the first time she spoke. Her voice was cold and distant, like the whisper of wind through a graveyard. "Why do you disturb me, mortal? Do you wish to die? No, Kieran replied. I wish to give you peace. The banshee laughed, a hollow, haunting sound. Peace? My peace was stolen from me long ago. You cannot undo what has been done. Siren reached into his satchel and pulled out a small vial of herbs mixed with holy water. Your curse was born of betrayal and pain. But what if I could break it? What if I could release you from this torment? The banshee's expression flickered, a hint of longing breaking through her cold exterior. You cannot change the past, she said. But I can honor it, Siren countered. Siren spent the next 3 nights preparing a ritual to release the banshee's spirit. With the villagers' reluctant help, he gathered sacred herbs, carved protective runes, and built a pyre at the edge of the forest. On the 4th night beneath the full moon, the banshee appeared. The villagers watched from a safe distance as Kieran stepped into the clearing, the flames of the pyre casting long shadows. This will not erase your pain, Siren said, but it will free you from it. The banshee floated above the pyre, her form shimmering with unearthly light. As Kieran chanted an ancient incantation, her scream filled the air once more. But this time, it was different. Not a cry of vengeance, but a wail of sorrow and release. The flames roared higher, consuming the pyre and illuminating the forest. When they finally died down, the banshee was gone. The village of Arendor was never the same. The banshee's scream no longer haunted the night, and the iron charms were taken down. Life slowly returned to normal, but the memory of the curse lingered. Siren stayed in Arendor for several months, documenting the banshee's story and ensuring her memory was preserved. When he finally left, the villagers gifted him a small silver charm, a token of their gratitude. As he walked away from the village, Kieran glanced back at the forest. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing among the trees, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes. And then she was gone, leaving only the whisper of wind and the promise of peace. In the quiet town of Evermore, where cobblestone streets wound through shadowy alleys and the scent of rain lingered in the air, there was a legend whispered from one generation to the next. The townsfolk spoke of a vampire unlike any other, a creature who fed not on blood, but on the memories of the living. They called it the memory thief, and those who encountered it were said to lose pieces of themselves forever. Isolde wandered the outskirts of Evermore, as she always did, the hem of her dark cloak brushing against the damp earth. She had lived for centuries, but her mind was a tapestry of fragments. She could recall flashes of the life she had before, the warmth of a fire, a child's laughter, a lover's touch. But the details were like smoke, slipping through her fingers whenever she tried to grasp them. She didn't know how she had become what she was. The hunger had simply appeared one day, an insatiable need to consume. It wasn't blood that sustained her, but the memories of others. With each memory she took, her victims forgot moments of joy, sorrow, or love, leaving them hollow and confused. Isolde hated herself for it, yet the hunger was relentless, and she was powerless to resist it. One cold autumn evening, a stranger arrived in Evermore. His name was Elias, a historian and scholar drawn to the town by the stories of its mysterious vampire. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked with silver, Elias carried an air of quiet determination. He rented a room at the inn and spent his days in the town library, poring over old tomes and questioning the villagers about the memory thief. Most refused to speak to him, their faces pale with fear. But an old woman, her hands trembling as she sipped her tea, told him what she knew. They say it comes at night, she whispered. It doesn't leave marks like the others, but you'll wake up different. You'll lose something important, something you can't get back. Elias thanked her and returned to his room, his mind racing. He didn't fear the creature, he pitied it. He had spent years studying the supernatural, and he believed every curse had a cause, and perhaps a cure. That night, Elias ventured into the woods. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting long shadows among the trees. He carried no weapons, only a small journal and a quill tucked into his coat. He didn't have to wait long. Isolde emerged from the shadows, her movements fluid and silent. She was strikingly beautiful, with raven black hair and eyes like liquid silver. But there was a sadness in her gaze, a heaviness that spoke of centuries of regret. You shouldn't be here, she said, her voice soft but firm. I'm looking for you, Elias replied, meeting her gaze. I've heard your story. I want to help. Isolde's lips curved into a bitter smile. Help? You can't help me. You should leave before it's too late. But Elias stood his ground. You feed on memories, don't you? Why? Her expression darkened. Because I must. It's not a choice. It's a curse. Elias didn't flinch as Isolde stepped closer, the air around her growing colder. He could see the hunger in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she fought to keep herself from reaching out. Take one of mine, Hanem, he said. She froze. What? You said it's not a choice, so take one of mine. If it helps you, then perhaps I can find a way to end this curse. Isolde hesitated. No one had ever offered themselves willingly. Her hunger clawed at her, and the temptation was unbearable. Before she could stop herself, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his temple. The moment her touch connected, Elias's mind opened to her like a book. She saw flashes of his life, a warm study filled with books, a mother's gentle smile, the heartbreak of a lost love. She drank deeply, the memories flooding her with warmth and vitality. When she pulled away, Elias staggered, his hand gripping a nearby tree for support. His face was pale, his brow furrowed in confusion. What did you take? He asked. A childhood memory, she admitted. A small one. He nodded, though he couldn't remember what he had lost. Did it help? Isolde's eyes filled with tears. For a moment, yes, but it won't last. Over the next few weeks, Elias and Isolde worked together. He delved into ancient texts, searching for mentions of curses similar to hers. She shared what little she remembered of her past, piecing together fragments of her life before the hunger consumed her. Through their conversations, Elias learned that Isolde's curse had been placed on her by a spurned lover, a powerful sorcerer who had sought to bind her to him forever. When she had rejected him, he had cursed her to a life of eternal hunger, feeding on the memories of others so she would never hold on to her own. If we can find his talisman, Elias said one evening, we might be able to break the curse. Their search led them to an abandoned manor deep in the forest. The sorcerer had died centuries ago, but his presence lingered in the crumbling walls and the oppressive atmosphere. In the manor's heart, they found a blackened, cracked mirror, a relic imbued with dark magic. Isolde could feel the weight of it, the way it seemed to pulse with her curse. Elias began the ritual, reciting incantations he had found in an ancient grimoire. As he chanted, the mirror's surface rippled, and a shadowy figure emerged. You dare to defy me? The figure hissed. She belongs to me. Isolde stepped forward, her voice steady. I belong to no one. The sorcerer's spirit unleashed a torrent of dark energy, but Elias held firm, his voice rising above the chaos. Isolde, drawing on centuries of strength, placed her hands on the mirror's surface and pushed. The glass shattered, and with it, the curse. For the first time in centuries, Isolde felt the hunger fade. Her memories began to return, each one flooding her with warmth and light. She wept as she remembered the life she had lost, the love she had known. Elias, though weakened from the ordeal, smiled. You're free now. Isolde stayed in Evermore, using her knowledge and wisdom to help the villagers she had once feared to harm. She and Elias grew close, their bond deepened by their shared journey. The memory thief was no more. In her place stood a woman who had reclaimed her life, one memory at a time. In the small, rain-drenched town of Black Hollow, the residents spoke in hushed tones of the peripheral spirit, a phantom that was said to dwell in the edges of sight. It never revealed itself directly, but lingered just beyond one's focus, a fleeting shadow, a whisper of movement, a trick of the eye. No one could describe its face or form. It was there, and then gone, always leaving behind an eerie sensation, as though a cold hand had brushed the back of your neck. Some believed it was harmless, a specter born of imagination. Others, those who had experienced its full presence, warned otherwise. Claire Marlowe had lived in Black Hollow all her life, working as a librarian in the town's ancient, creaking library. She had heard the stories of the peripheral spirit from her grandmother, who swore that it had haunted the family for generations. But Claire dismissed it as folklore. a tale designed to keep children from wandering into the misty woods after dark. One evening, as she locked up the library, a chill ran down her spine. She glanced over her shoulder, certain she had seen something move just outside the range of her vision. Turning her head sharply, she found nothing but rows of dusty bookshelves and the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through the window. "Just tired," she muttered to herself. But the feeling lingered as she walked home through the narrow streets. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist, and every time she looked directly at them, they were still. It wasn't until she reached her door that she caught it again. A faint outline, like a figure watching her from the corner of her eye. When she spun around, it was gone. The encounters became more frequent over the next few weeks. At first, Claire tried to ignore it. She told herself it was stress or her imagination playing tricks. But the spirit became bolder. While working late one night in the library, she felt a cold breath on her neck. She froze, her heart pounding. In her peripheral vision, she saw a shadow standing just behind her, a tall, indistinct figure. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The room was silent, save for the creak of the old building settling. When she turned, there was nothing there. That night, she began hearing whispers. They were faint, unintelligible, like distant voices carried on the wind. She tried to sleep, but the whispers followed her into her dreams, pulling her into restless, haunted slumber. Desperate, Claire turned to her grandmother, a woman known for her belief in the supernatural. When Claire explained what was happening, her grandmother's face grew pale. "It's the peripheral spirit," she said gravely. "It's been with our family for generations. It doesn't harm, not at first, but it feeds on your fear, your doubt. The more you notice it, the stronger it becomes." "What does it want?" Claire asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her grandmother hesitated. "It's searching for something, or someone. It attaches itself to a host, lingering until it finds what it's looking for. But no one knows how to make it leave." Claire began digging into the history of Black Hollow, hoping to find some clue about the spirit's origin. The library held dusty archives filled with records dating back centuries. She discovered accounts of a mysterious figure who had vanished from the town in the 1800s, a recluse named Elias Kane. He had been a scholar obsessed with the afterlife, conducting bizarre experiments in his crumbling mansion at the edge of the woods. Locals believed he had summoned something unnatural, and after his disappearance, strange occurrences began. People reported seeing shadows that weren't there, hearing whispers in empty rooms, and feeling an unseen presence watching them. Claire found an old photograph of Elias. In the background, blurred and faint, she could see the outline of a shadowy figure. The more Claire researched, the more the spirit seemed to invade her life. She began catching glimpses of it in every reflective surface, in the edges of her bathroom mirror, the corner of her computer screen, the glass of her window at night. The whispers grew louder, forming broken words that sent shivers down her spine. "Find me." One night, the spirit grew bold. As Claire read in bed, the air in her room grew icy. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the figure standing at the foot of her bed, its form more distinct than ever. She could make out its long, bony fingers and a hood that obscured its face. Terrified, she didn't dare look directly at it. "What do you want?" she whispered. The whispers coalesced into a single word: "Remember." Claire realized the spirit was tied to Elias Kane and his forgotten mansion. Armed with a flashlight and trembling courage, she ventured into the woods to find the crumbling structure. The mansion was in ruins, its windows shattered and its doors hanging from their hinges. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Her flashlight illuminated faded wallpaper and broken furniture, but the real discovery lay in the basement. There, she found Elias's study. Ancient books lined the shelves, and strange symbols were carved into the stone walls. At the center of the room was a mirror, its surface dark and clouded. The spirit appeared in the mirror, its form shifting and indistinct. Claire felt its presence surround her, the whispers filling the room. "You're Elias," she said, the realization dawning on her. "You became this spirit." The figure didn't respond but reached out with a shadowy hand. Memories flooded Claire's mind. Elias's experiments, his desperate attempts to connect with the afterlife. and the moment he was consumed by the very entity he tried to control. "You're trapped," she said softly. The spirit's whispers grew frantic, pleading, "Free me." Claire realized the mirror was the key. It was the object Elias had used to bind himself to the spirit world, and it was now his prison. She found a ritual in one of Elias's books, a way to sever the connection. As she recited the incantation, the room filled with a deafening howl. The spirit lashed out, its shadowy form swirling around her, but she stood firm. The mirror shattered with a blinding flash of light. The whispers ceased, and the oppressive presence lifted. Claire returned to Black Hollow, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The peripheral spirit was gone. Its centuries-long torment finally ended. Though the town's shadows no longer whispered, Claire occasionally felt a faint presence at the edges of her vision. But this time, it wasn't cold or threatening. It was warm, as though Elias was watching over her, grateful for his release. The legend of the peripheral spirit faded into memory, but Claire would never forget the figure that lingered just out of sight, waiting for its moment to be seen. In the quiet town of Willowsbend, nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, strange happenings began to unsettle its residents. At first they were minor annoyances: a chair not quite where it was left, a book taken off the shelf and placed on a table, or a vase moved just slightly askew. But as the incidents grew more bizarre and frequent, the townsfolk began whispering about an invisible entity, an unseen force that rearranged furniture in people's homes while they weren't looking. They called it the Silent Rearranger, and though it seemed harmless at first, its antics would soon reveal a darker intent. Emma Wakefield was the first to notice. A young artist living alone in a quaint cottage on the edge of town, she often worked late into the night, painting in the warm glow of her studio lamp. One morning she awoke to find her easel moved to the opposite side of the room. "That's odd," she muttered, assuming she had moved it the night before and forgotten. But over the following days, more peculiar things happened. Her sofa was rotated to face the wall. Her dining table chairs were stacked precariously in the corner. Even her bed, heavy and difficult to move, was shifted 2 feet from its original position. At first, Emma laughed it off, joking to her friends about her helpful ghost. But when she came home one evening to find her entire living room rearranged into a chaotic maze of furniture, her amusement turned to unease. Emma wasn't the only one experiencing the strange phenomenon. All across Willowsbend, residents reported similar occurrences. The local baker found his shop counter moved into the middle of the room. The school teacher discovered her desks arranged in a perfect spiral. An elderly couple woke up to find their bed facing the wrong direction, with all their clothes neatly folded on the floor. The town council convened an emergency meeting to address the escalating situation. "It's a prank," insisted Mr. Hargrove, the skeptical postmaster. "Kids playing tricks." But others weren't so sure. "How do you explain the locked doors and windows?" asked Mrs. Fenwick, whose entire china cabinet had been rearranged overnight. Theories ranged from mischievous spirits to magnetic anomalies, but no one could provide a concrete explanation. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Emma set up cameras in her cottage. She wanted to catch the culprit in the act, whether it was a prankster or something more otherworldly. The first few nights yielded nothing but silence. The furniture remained untouched, and Emma began to wonder if the entity had moved on. But on the fourth night, her camera captured something chilling. The footage showed her living room at 2:13 a.m. The furniture began to shift on its own, gliding silently across the floor. The movements were deliberate, almost methodical, as if an unseen hand was orchestrating the changes. Emma replayed the video over and over, her heart pounding. There was no visible figure, no sign of strings or wires. Whatever was moving her furniture was truly invisible. Emma shared the footage with the town, and it wasn't long before others began setting up cameras in their homes. The recordings all showed the same thing: furniture moving as if guided by an unseen force. But Emma noticed something others hadn't. The rearrangements weren't random. In every case, the furniture seemed to form patterns, circles, lines, and symbols she didn't recognize. Curious, she took her findings to Professor Gerald, an eccentric historian who lived on the outskirts of town. His home, crammed with books and artifacts, smelled of old paper and pipe smoke. "These symbols," Emma said, showing him sketches of the patterns, Do they mean anything to you? The professor studied them intently, his brows furrowing. These are ancient warding symbols, he said finally. They were used to seal or summon entities in rituals. The professor explained that the symbols were part of an old forbidden practice, meant to bind spirits to specific locations. If these patterns were appearing in the town, it meant someone or something was attempting to complete a ritual. But why would it rearrange furniture? Emma asked. Gerald shrugged. Perhaps it's trying to communicate, or perhaps it's preparing for something. That night, Emma stayed awake, watching her living room with a mix of dread and determination. At exactly 3 a.m., the air in the room grew colder. The faint scent of burning wood filled her nostrils. From the corner of her eye, she saw the furniture begin to shift. This time it moved more violently, the sofa scraping against the floor, the coffee table flipping onto its side. And then she felt it, a presence. Though she couldn't see it directly, she sensed something standing just beyond her line of sight, watching her. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The air seemed to vibrate, and a deep, disembodied voice echoed in her mind. "Release me." Emma rushed back to Professor Gerald the next morning, recounting what had happened. Together they scoured his books for any mention of spirits bound by warding symbols. They discovered an old tale about a man who had tried to summon a spirit centuries ago, but had failed to control it. The entity had been trapped in Willow's Bend ever since, bound by the furniture and objects in its vicinity. "It's using the furniture to recreate the symbols and break its bonds," Gerald explained. "But what happens if it succeeds?" Emma asked, dread curling in her stomach. Gerald's face darkened. "If it's a malevolent spirit, it could wreak havoc." Emma and Gerald devised a plan to disrupt the entity's ritual. They gathered salt, candles, and herbs, creating a protective circle in Emma's home. That night they waited, prepared to face whatever came. At 3 a.m., the furniture began to move again, more aggressively than ever. The air crackled with energy, and the invisible entity's presence pressed against them like a physical weight. "Hold the circle!" Gerald shouted as the sofa slammed against the walls and chairs toppled over. The entity roared, an unearthly sound that made the room tremble. Emma clutched a bundle of herbs, chanting the banishment spell Gerald had taught her. The entity's rage grew as the protective circle disrupted its power. Shadows flickered at the edge of Emma's vision, and for a brief moment, she saw its true form, a towering, featureless figure made of swirling darkness. With a final defiant scream, the entity disappeared, and the furniture fell still. The town of Willow's Bend returned to normal. Furniture stayed where it was placed, and the eerie rearrangement ceased. Emma became something of a local hero, though she downplayed her role in the events. Despite the calm, she couldn't shake the feeling that the entity wasn't entirely gone. Sometimes when she was alone, she thought she saw the faintest flicker of movement in her peripheral vision, but she chose not